A reading from the book of Genesis. Now the serpent was the most cunning of all the animals that the Lord God had made. The serpent asked the woman, "Did God really tell you not to eat from any of the trees in the garden?" The woman answered the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden. It is only about the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden that God said, 'You shall not eat it or even touch it, lest you die.'" But the serpent said to the woman, "You certainly will not die. No, God knows well that the moment you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like gods who know what is good and what is evil." The woman saw that the tree was good for food, pleasing to the eyes, and desirable for gaining wisdom. So she took some of its fruit and ate it. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized that they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. When they heard the sound of the Lord God moving about in the garden at the breezy time of the day, the man and his wife hid themselves from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. The word of the Lord.
Responsorial Psalm. The response is, "Blessed are those whose sins are forgiven. Blessed is he whose fault is taken away, whose sin is covered. Blessed the man to whom the Lord imputes not guilt, in whose spirit there is no guile. Blessed are those whose sins are forgiven." Then I acknowledged my sin to you. My guilt I covered not. I said, "I confess my faults to the Lord, and you took away the guilt of my sin." Blessed are those whose sins are forgiven. For this shall every faithful man pray to you in time of stress. Though deep waters overflow, they shall not reach him. Blessed are those whose sins are forgiven. You are my shelter. From distress you will preserve me. With glad cries of freedom you will ring me round. Blessed are those whose sins are forgiven.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus left the district of Tyre and went by way of Sidon to the Sea of Galilee into the district of the Decapolis. And people brought to him a deaf man who had a speech impediment and begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him off by himself away from the crowd. He put his finger into the man's ears and, spitting, touched his tongue. Then he looked up to heaven and groaned and said to him, "Aphathatha," that is, be opened. And immediately the man's ears were opened. His speech impediment was removed, and he spoke plainly. He ordered them not to tell anyone. But the more he ordered them not to, the more they proclaimed it. They were exceedingly astonished, and they said, "He has done all things well. He makes the deaf hear and the mute speak." The Gospel of the Lord.
The first reading comes from Genesis 3, 1-8. Yesterday, the account taken from Genesis ends with the idea that Adam and Eve are living in a primitive innocence, that they're naked but they're not ashamed. Well, this phrase is altered just a little bit for the next verse, because we hear that the serpent is the most cunning of animals. It's a little bit of a wordplay in Hebrew, changing a couple letters to give a different sense. Now, this serpent in later literature will be identified as Satan, but in this account it never really says Satan. It is simply a story of a serpent, which was considered a clever animal, but clever in a bad sense. It was always a danger. And in fact, this serpent entices Eve to eat of the fruit of the tree that they're not supposed to, the tree of all knowledge. It implies that God is just jealous. He wants to hold something back from Adam and Eve. And isn't that an irony? God has given them paradise, and they're not satisfied because there's one thing that they can't have. The woman, in responding to the serpent's question, did God say you can't eat it. It says we can't even touch it, otherwise we'll die. Remember in the account it really didn't say that, but you can see how this is playing in her mind. That God wouldn't even allow us to touch it. God wouldn't allow us to get near to it because he's holding something back. And the serpent is very clever in the way that he entices her to look at it, to see how good it is, to eat it. This is a perfect example of what temptation does to us. That it begins to entice us, things look better than they are, and we do something that really we don't even want to do. She eats it, gives some of it to her husband, and their eyes are opened. They now have the knowledge of good and evil, knowledge of all things, but it doesn't make them better people. Knowledge is not what's so important. Wisdom is. Wisdom would have been to say no, to resist this temptation. They don't. And so they cover up their nakedness. Previously they were innocent. Nakedness didn't bother them. Now they cover up their nakedness and they hide from God who's walking in the midst of the trees. Notice it's very anthropomorphic, picturing God almost as somebody taking an evening walk. This is typical of the Yahwist account. The priestly account, which was written a few centuries later, would be more spiritual in his approach to God. God is the one who loves them most, and sin has caused them to hide from him. One of the first effects of sin is alienation. And in fact, in the next passage we'll hear that sin causes human beings to be alienated from God, from each other, and even from creation. The Gospel is from Mark 7:31 to 37. Jesus goes from Tyre, which is pagan territory, to Decapolis, which is another pagan territory. And the people bring a man who's deaf, has a speech impediment, and Jesus opens his ears and his tongue. He says, Ephatha, let it be opened. In fact, in the baptism ceremony, we still use this ritual. We bless the tongue and the ears of the child so that whatever the child say will be in God's name. Whatever the child hears will be the message of God. The man is able to speak, and people are astonished by this. He does all things well. He makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. They recognize that he has the authority of God. And remember, this is being said, this is being performed in pagan territory. His own people, from his own village, from the Pharisees, would not accept him. So Jesus is reaching out to those who will accept him, the Gentiles. And may God bless us.